The Free Speech Podcast is an initiative of SFLC.IN under the Free Speech Project to understand the changing landscape of free speech in an internet enabled world. We have spoken to a host of journalists, activists, lawyers, and scholars to understand and rethink our current landscape around free speech in India.
Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Free Speech Podcast run by SFLC.IN. Today, our guest is Miss Bishakha Datta. Bishakha is a filmmaker, activist, and a former journalist. Her work focuses on issues of gender, sexuality, and digital technology. She is the co founder and executive director of Point of View, a Mumbai based organization working towards amplifying voices of women and other marginalized communities. She was the trustee of the Wikimedia Foundation from 2010 to 2014. Her work includes 9 Degrees of Justice, a collection of essays, Who Will Make Chapatis, and a documentary titled The Flesh. Bishakha holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in mass communication. Welcome to the podcast, Bishakha. So
Thank you
happy
so
to
much.
see you and have you here.
Thanks so much, Radhika, and thank you to SFLC as well for actually having the podcast, and I'm delighted to be a guest.
Nice. So Vishaka, there's so many things happening in the world right now, and as we see that it's on an everyday basis that we keep hearing about gender violence, and we keep hearing about people suffering all sorts of indignities. My first question to you is, that there are multiple provisions in the IPC IT Act, and now even under the intermediary guidelines which restrict free speech, right? We have these new ethics codes which sort of has a regulatory overview on OTT and news platforms.
Yeah.
Can you explain how these laws are actually being used to institutionalize the morality of the majority or the biases against gender and sexual minorities through restricting their freedom of expression? And what impact do you see that these regressive laws are going to have on gender and sexual minorities in the long run?
Thanks, Radhika. That's a great question and quite a complicated one, but let me try and tackle it to the best of my ability. So let me start actually with the law that we have studied at Point of View, and this is a section of the IT Act called Section 67, which basically regulates obscenity online or in digital spaces, right? Now, when we think about it, it sounds like, yes, of course, this is exactly the kind of law that we need to stop harassment and to stop online violence against women, trans, queer persons, etc. But the way it is worded, this law, in this section in particular, actually is not rights based. So it doesn't actually recognize the rights of individuals to talk about, particularly adults, to talk about sexuality or to explore what we call sexual speech or sexual expression. Instead, and let me give you an example, one of the things we see in the digital age is that speech or expression is not confined just to words any longer, right? We speak through our images sometimes, right? We send images to each other, and we often don't even exchange words. We might put an emoji. So first of all, speech or expression is actually multimodal now. It's not just words. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. And let's take an example where, say, two people are sending each other intimate images of themselves for their own enjoyment and their own private consumption, right? Unfortunately, this would be considered obscene under the way Section 67 is currently worded, which means if a third party, for some reason, were to see these images, right, or take some sort of offense, they could actually report these two people under this particular provision, Section 67. So you see what's happening here is several things. It's a societal understanding of sexuality that is framing the way this section is crafted, right? So there's an understanding that sending intimate, nude, sexy images to each other is something that is dirty, that is deviant, that is inherently wrong, even if it's consensual. And so, two people who are adults who could really be just, exchanging images with one another could actually be prosecuted or be accused of obscenity under a provision such as this. So this is a very concrete example, and there are similar provisions again in the Indian Penal Code as well, which deal with concepts like obscenity. The other thing I do want to say about this particular provision is it actually, is also being used after the reading down of Section 66A to deal with other kinds of speech which are actually outside its ambit, right? So, whether it's political speech, all sorts of complaints have been filed under this provision, which has become basically like a dumping ground or, like a trash can, where any sort of speech that can't be dealt with and that, certain people may take offense at are sort of dumped in here. So it's totally outside scope and is being used in a very broad sense, not to meaningfully actually regulate the few things that we can actually consider obscene, but a wide range of speech. So this is one example I wanted to talk about, and the corollary is actually there is a provision in the Information Technology Act actually called Provision 66E, which recognizes that images of one's private parts used without one's consent are punishable. And I would argue that that's a very progressive section, because suppose somebody takes my private images, right, and tries to circulate them, I can go and complain and say, hey, this is what's happening to me and this is being done without my consent. But unfortunately, this provision is hardly used at all. And if it were used, it could actually meaningfully, it could actually, it could actually expand or make freedom of speech more easily available to women, to people who are marginalized in society and who are always, scared that something will happen to our images or somebody will misuse them, etc. So just a little bit, yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's quite interesting to know, actually. I mean, we always thought that consent is going to be a big part of it. And I mean, it's twisted. And, I was just discussing with somebody that like consent is not like a lot of women, if you speak to them, you end up realizing that when they were sexually harassed in school, it is only in their 20s that they understand that they were harassed,
Exactly.
because because like consent as like something is just not taught.
Yeah, exactly.
um
And we see
yeah.
that really sort of floating digitally. See, so if
Right.
consent is not taught even in physical spaces when we are kids, etc., and then because speech has become like a flow today, right? If we think of,
Yeah.
like, it's just a flow of images,
Mhm.
words, all sorts of things. So often, when some bit of speech that we have produced slips out of our flow, often we don't even think about it as a violation, right? Because there's some
Right.
sort of concept online that consent is assumed, right? Yeah, which is a very tricky
Yeah.
concept in my opinion.
True, 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 true. It's a very, very slippery slopes
Yeah,
and very, I mean, lack of education, so to say. Vijaka, my next question to you is, how on one hand, where we know that there is actually a need to regulate online speech because of harassment and exploitation that gender minorities have to face online. They're often done to silence them or to threaten them or to, just, I mean, shrink their spaces. But how do you think that a balance can be stuck in policy, so as to, reduce, I mean, so as to ensure that free speech is maintained
yeah.
and as well as they're not harassed?
This is a great question, actually. So, I think, first of all, we have to get away from the old understanding of free speech, right? Which is that I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend like your right to say it, because that was made in a context where there was very little speech. Now we are in the exact opposite context where there's too much speech, right? I think the second thing is, so we have to delineate what is harmless speech or legitimate speech. And I think the real concept here is of what is harm, what speech causes harm. But again, it's not about causing an imagined harm. It's speech that causes an actual harm. So, for instance, I would argue that, a lot of the speech that we see nowadays, say on social media platforms, right, which targets, say, specific castes or specific religions, or which target like persons from gender minorities, right? I would say that those cause actual harm, either to the whole group or to that individual person. And that, to me, it is meaningless to fight for that as free speech, right? So those kinds of things. And even on online spaces, there's always a power sort of arc, right? So we often see that people who are relatively powerless because of caste or gender or sexuality get targeted by people who have much more power, including the power of language and the power of mobs, or what are called cyber troops, right? Ganging up on one person. So this causes actual harm, and we know that this kind of thing has mental health consequences. It has physical health consequences. There are people who have removed themselves and self-censored themselves when facing this kind of speech. So I think, to me, it's really about very carefully, like, delineating what causes actual harm. And I think we have enough case studies to be able to do that, and really cracking down on that. And it's not just the law. I think the platforms have a huge role to play here, because platforms today govern our day-to-day speech and their policies, etc. So it's very, very critical that they recognize that they cannot wash their hands of the harms that are taking place on platforms that they own and run, and that they really take serious responsibility for making these spaces, spaces where all people, regardless of their situation, right, can speak freely. What is the use of a platform if half the people, or like, if we were to do a study, we'd see way more women, gender and sexual minorities leaving these platforms, at least for short periods of time, just to stay sane and to keep, like, keep themselves going. Yeah.
Yeah, then there was an Amnesty report called the Troll Patrol also, which spoke really in detail about it. Even we did a report on online harassment a while back, and I think we need to do another one soon. But I mean, even in our day-to-day lives, we hear from so many people about these things that, oh, we've left this platform because just could not take the trolling.
Correct.
And all of us, right, so many times, all of us, anything that doesn't fix the majority view, it's told upon.
Yeah, exactly.
Vishaka, my next question to you, we are talking about just being on the platform, we're talking about free speech, but access to internet and devices is a prerequisite to even express yourself on social media platforms. And of course, there's a very clear gender divide in access to this. On top of which, we often see moral norms of the society which feel that women must be protected from digital world, that women are not safe on Facebook, and parents mostly not letting young women go on Facebook and make accounts on Instagram because it might lead to corruption of their minds or distract themselves from education. There was in Farima Shireen judgment in which, I mean, even SFLC was an impleader. And we really and women were not allowed, like college going women were not allowed to use mobile phones after a certain period in their hostels. A community in Gujarat banned cell phones for college going girls. How do you think that this problem of access can be solved, especially when these perceptions are also sometimes backed by state agencies and institutions?
Thanks, Radhika. Another great question. So I think, we have to look at access, first of all, not just as a technological issue, right? it clearly has a socio-cultural kind of dimension to it, which is what prevents girls, women, trans persons, etc., from being given free, unconditional access. And I think here we have to work at several levels. We see, first of all, that families will give digital devices to their sons, but not to their daughters freely. And this is so startling in the middle of the pandemic, when all online education, everything, right, like has even getting relief during COVID or getting health services, everything has gone online or through mobile phones. So I think first is at the family level, just like in an earlier age, boys used to be given better nutrition, better education, better, like, being prepared for life, better opportunities and resources. We have to make families understand that the mobile phone is a critical resource in a digital world. And that if they don't give it to girls or to other gender minorities, then it's actually like a form of gender discrimination. So beginning here, similarly, panchayats, communities, or political leaders really have to stop thinking of like, that the mobile phone is just like some frivolous device, right? And really understand that it's literally a critical resource. Like tribal families say, Jal, Jangal, Zameen, which is land, water, forest. Uh, I say nowadays land, water, forest, and mobile for everybody. So, if communities, if policymakers don't realize that without this mobile phone, they're actually restricting this person's future. As a gender, women will fall back if they don't have access, because they have lower access to information, to education, to so many things. So I think it has to be a much bigger conversation, not about technology, but about gender discrimination. And we really have to say that this is a new form of gender discrimination and push for it to be sort of, treated like that.
Yeah. Right, yeah. And I think a lot of families have shared devices these days.
Yeah.
A lot of women, I mean, train certain young women to have some sort of security practices online. And you see that they face so much harassment. And like if the parents find out that they have a Facebook account, they're often beaten up. They're not even allowed to attend their online classes. And rather than like educating them on how, like, and that's the onus is also on schools and like government to make sure that they use these devices safely. It's just taken away from them, like like they're trying to find an excuse that,
Yeah.
oh, here, that's how I can reasonably take it without feeling guilty about it. um
But
but
that
like,
is
I
to
mean,
me discrimination, because how is it that your son can
yeah,
have the same device and do everything?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Vishaka, would you think that visual media, because you're a filmmaker and you've done like a lot of like film, I think video activism as well, if I'm not wrong. Then what do you think that is like, can visual media play a role in educating and spreading awarenesses on issues such as free speech, content moderation, issues that are slightly more complicated to understand, even for us technology professionals? We also don't know an answer to content moderation and like, the balance between hate speech and free speech. Do you think that this can help?
Yeah. I think actually, if you ask me honestly, I think YouTube is like the biggest educator. So, for example, if I start using some new software and I don't know how to use it properly, I just get onto YouTube and do some tutorial, right? So, I'm using visuals to understand. So, similarly, all these concepts, which are very complicated when we just talk about them, making little simple videos can really help. And we actually did it in a project with domestic workers last year during COVID, who we were training. We just asked somebody to make literally take screenshots and make very simple videos, which we would send them by WhatsApp. And they all said, oh my God, this really helped us understand. So, there's so many ways in which the visual medium can be used. And I hope we actually start thinking about some of these too, really bring these
Yeah.
complicated concepts in a more relatable way to people.
Right, right. So, my last question to you, and this is a question that we're just asking all of our guests. Do you think that right to freedom of speech and expression should be an absolute right, or should it have certain reasonable restrictions, like it already does in India?
Uh, in the past, I used to say it should be an absolute right. Till the internet came along, or till the mobile internet came along, and we saw the kind of harassment that it can cause to many, many people who lack power. Now I no longer feel comfortable saying that it should be an absolute right, but I do feel that the restrictions that we currently have are not necessarily the restrictions I would want for it to be meaningful for people who lack power.
Right. Thank you so much, Shaka. I mean, we're very, very glad to have you, I'm sure. This conversation has frankly added a lot to my understanding. And I hope we can have more such conversations in the future to expand, to rethink our laws, to rethink the way that free speech is conceived by the society now in the internet enabled world. I'm
Thank you
looking
so much
forward
for
to.
having me. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, made me think so much too. Thanks.
Thank you. We did too. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.